All right, hello everybody out there. Welcome to this week's Hack Surfer Hangout. Today we're going to be talking with Kevin O'Brien. He's our sort of MVP. He was our first second-time guest. Now he's our first third-time guest as well. How are you doing today, Kevin?
Doing great. How are you, Jeff?
Pretty good. Last time we spoke with you, you were over at CloudLock, and now you're with a different company. Maybe you can kind of explain a little bit about that transition and what you're doing now.
Yeah, of course. I had the opportunity to join as a founding team member of a company called Conjur. Conjur does an Auth-Z solution for the cloud. Auth-Z is authorization, different from authentication or authent. We make a product and a platform that is typically used by DevOps people to monitor, manage, secure, and audit all of the authorization and access that they're seeing in their infrastructure. And that can be anything from an Amazon stack to Azure, to VMs, even down to bare metal.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we kind of, sort of the genesis of, this topic was, Code Spaces. I guess it was probably a month or two back, they went out of business. And, since then there's been just a lot of talk about, how it affects the cloud. And, obviously they were sort of operating with, through Amazon and, basically got knocked out of business. So that sort of has a lot of effects. I don't know, maybe you can kind of explain a little bit what happened with Code Spaces?
Yeah, of course. So Code Spaces is interesting, right? Like what you see there is that you had a external user, we think, gain access to the root credentials effectively for their Amazon instance. And they were able to use those to then get access to all of the system backups, all of the servers, all of the infrastructure that Code Spaces had in play, take it down and make it such that it was impossible for the company to restore from backup. In many ways, what this was a failure on multiple levels, right? You had an inappropriate handling of authorization and credentials for somebody who we think was former employee, although they haven't proven it, and I don't think they ever will. You also have an escalation of privileges issue where the machine password used to gain access to one particular piece of their infrastructure was connected to their backups and was able to be used to destroy what was supposed to be their failover/redundancy system. So it was really just a systemic collapse, and when it happened, within a couple of days, Code Spaces came out and said, we can't recover from this, and they shut down their entire company.
Yeah, I was reading one article, and also your guys' blog that you did about it, where basically was described, sort of as a nightmare scenario for cloud security. So I guess, kind of the question is, is that something that you see maybe happening again or to other companies, or, was it more just a fault of Code Spaces, not doing things properly?
So Code Spaces certainly has some blame here, right? The organization had a strict policy of redundant off-site backups and supposedly would never have allowed this to have occurred. And that didn't really work for them. They ended up having a different reality from what they said they would do in policy. And for many people, that was catastrophic. They lost months, years of work that were stored in the repository that Code Spaces held. That aside, I mean, the more interesting question is the one you started with. And I think we will see this sort of thing happen again. And the reason is that the landscape in which this type of vulnerability exists has grown significantly, even from the first time that you and I spoke, Jeff. I think when we look at security in the cloud, what people glommed onto initially was the idea that you had to protect your public cloud infrastructure. So you needed to do the sorts of things that you would see a CloudLock do, which is where you would have security for Google Apps or security for Salesforce. And that's completely true. You do need that, and it's critical. But many organizations over the intervening few years have started to move their core infrastructure out into the cloud. And they're doing it because there are tremendous cost savings benefits and innovation accelerant benefits. That is, people can work more quickly, knocking down barriers between developers and infrastructure and IT operations, what we sometimes call DevOps. But in doing that, you're broadening your threat surface because now, instead of having a locked server room where maybe all of the servers that contain your backups are, you're putting them out into infrastructure in the cloud. And if you get it wrong somewhere along the line, if you don't deprovision a user's password and they leave on bad terms, or You have a password that you embed in some script somewhere. Maybe you're running it through one of the new configuration management tools we see taking off, things like Chef and Puppet and Salt. Or maybe it's part of a Docker image, and that Docker image gets misused or has an error in it somewhere. Then suddenly, what would have been an error on one piece of machinery 5-10 years ago replicates through this new infrastructure. And it happens so quickly that you can have a situation kind of like what we saw with code spaces, where it spirals out of control and your ability to rein it back in is very limited. So yeah, I think we'll see this continue to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just before we got on here, I was kind of reading your guys' blog post about sort of what happened, and there's basically 3 things mentioned in there. He's mentioned privileged access controls, defense in depth, and access intelligence were kind of things that could maybe prevent this. Can you just maybe explain just real simply like what those mean and how people can go about implementing those?
Yeah, absolutely. So this isn't a Conjur unique set of ideas, right? We think we have a solution to the problem via the platform we create, and that's something that is somewhat platform agnostic, and that's what we talk about in that blog post, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But more broadly, what you're looking at are themes that are coming out of the research arms of Forrester or some of the best practices you're going to see from the large security VARs. Or what they're talking about now are things like leaf privilege and defense in depth and zero trust networking. Fundamentally, the idea here is that you can no longer trust that any particular piece of your infrastructure is secure. So that has some pretty significant implications, right? I don't want to allow a user who, for me, might really be a user, or it might be a user who's being accessed by someone having those credentials, and it's not really Kevin, it's someone, I don't know, maybe in Russia just got access to my credentials through that database breach that's in the news today. And that user is suddenly doing things that don't make sense. Well, if I have a zero trust network, or if I have a principle of least privilege, then I can start to mitigate that. I can say that, Kevin, maybe you should be able to access this server, that server, but I have very robust and granular permission control in place, what we call access intelligence, that says that I shouldn't be able to spin up new production code servers, or I shouldn't be able to change the Git repository because I'm not in development, or I'm just not in IT. I'm a marketing guy. So you start to look at that and play it out, and what you're looking for is a way to enforce defense in depth. You don't have any single point of failure in an environment where the potential entry points have broadened and keep shifting. A great example of this, Netflix has this idea of Chaos Monkey, right? So they have this whole scripted thing that basically runs amok and tries to break their infrastructure. And they do this because they have a belief that if they can respond to Chaos Monkey, they can respond to real-world threat. We see and we think that as DevOps takes off, as more and more people are pushing out these ideas of running at cloud scale and cloud speed, of continuous integration, meaning that you're releasing code all the time, you need to be able to provide a very easy set of audit and security controls, which are different, but are both required so that you can respond to something like a Chaos Monkey. And if you did it correctly, you would say, we're going to always assume that one of those exists. We're always going to assume that anything and everything will be tested constantly. And if I have a problem, I want to be able to respond to it quickly. And I think code spaces have done that, right? You wouldn't have seen this same set of problems. But fortunately, people just aren't adapting as quickly as the threats are growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have one question that came in about code spaces. Richard, he says, when the code spaces company lost all of their infrastructure and data, was this simply a matter of no redundancy in place? Couldn't this have been remedied by having a hybrid of cloud and physical infrastructure planning? What fundamentally killed them?
Yeah, so what fundamentally killed code spaces, in my opinion, is that they didn't secure and segment their network properly. So certainly what happened there was that someone gained access to an open door somewhere, whether it's because they had a password that hadn't been deprovisioned, or they gained access to an SSH key that was able to be used to get back into the Amazon environment, and then escalated out to the backup servers. Yeah, that's a redundancy problem. Those servers should have had an air gap set of backup somewhere, sitting in a safe on tape, so that at minimum they could have brought things back 5 days out or 7 days out. But more broadly, what we're seeing there is that you are looking at environments where you may have a hybrid strategy, but you have different connection points between your physical and cloud infrastructure. And so there are things like points of presence that run on bare metal in a data center that you lease, but there are codes, services, what we kind of call robots in the modern cloud parlance, that have the ability to serve as intermediaries between those two. And if somebody can inject nefarious code into one of those service scripts, or if someone's able to gain access to the physical infrastructure, which might contain backups, it might contain things that you're assuming aren't going to be world accessible, you have the same problem. And that's where we start to look at what you can do from both a security perspective, that is making sure that you enforce these defense in depth ideas, that you have a model of least privilege and no one can go and do everything on all environments, but also a really rich and robust audit trail, that you have some mechanism through which you can say, who is touching those things? What are those scripts doing? How do I know when they start to do something that's maybe unusual, so that if I did have that hybrid environment, as Richard mentions, and then suddenly one of my services touches them and it shouldn't, I can immediately respond to that and cough its access.
Yeah, I guess, kind of what really surprises me is, I'm not really a security guy. I'm more sort of on the outside of it. So, I just kind of remember when I was taking my first programming class, 20 years ago, and like in grade school, and the teacher, that always say, save early, save often, and make a backup. That would sort of be like the mantra we all had to say. So I guess, from sort of an outside perspective, it seems like that's something every company should do, is kind of have, like you said, like a offsite backup. Do you think a lot of companies are kind of in that situation where they might not have that?
I don't know that it's the case that they don't have it, but I think it comes down to the fact that we're seeing companies in a macro sense, in an economic sense, being forced to innovate more quickly, to iterate more quickly, to get product out the door more quickly. And these are probably good things, right? They avoid a whole bunch of the programming pitfalls that you would have experienced, like I did, when we started learning how to code way back when. But in doing so, we're also shaving time down by automating more and more of our infrastructure, including things like backups. And humans are really bad at automation, right? So we tend to think about doing a manual repetitive task, and we get very lazy or sloppy. So there's a whole ecosystem of tools that are designed to improve automation when you start thinking about bringing servers up to handle backups. Maybe I don't know how big my backup system is going to have to be, but I have a script or an environment that running in, say, like Elastic Beanstalk or some other Amazon thing can bring up new servers and continually grow my environment or shrink it when I don't need it. But if I get something wrong in my configuration automation tool chain, then I might introduce a vulnerability. And if I don't have some way of segmenting that and thinking about that, and by the way, a lot of these tools just don't do it natively. They're designed for automation, not auditability and security. You start to find that there are systemic flaws, systemic cracks, and that's where someone can get in. So there may have been a backup. In fact, it sounds like something like Code Spaces there was, but the problem was that backup wasn't properly defended. And it's not like the 80s or early 90s where we have zip drives and tapes that sit in your drawer, and if somebody gets your infrastructure, you just pull one of those out, right? Backup these days tends to be sitting in the cloud as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, last time we spoke, we were kind of talking about, I forget what, or I think you were at the RSA conference, and you're talking about how there was, sort of this sort of push and pull going on, for the cloud, whether people were going to sort of lock everything down or whether they were going to, kind of allow more freedom. Mm-hmm. I guess it just seems like, obviously we had all the NSA stories, they're still coming out and people talking about that. That's kind of one aspect of the cloud, and then, we've got, the situation with Code Spaces that everyone's talking about. So I'm kind of curious if you've seen or maybe heard anything kind of maybe pushing it towards, kind of more of that the people wanted to sort of lock things down.
Yeah, I think it is increasingly a foregone conclusion that you need encryption. You need encryption at rest. You need encryption on the wire. You should be using HTTPS whenever you do any kind of public web transport. That is not really a debatable point. And I think anyone who's looking at stuff like how do I secure my data in public cloud should definitely be saying, well, how can I apply an encryption technology but do it in a way that doesn't fundamentally limit the benefits of my cloud. But I do think when we start talking about getting down to the infrastructure layer, maybe the platform layer, the other two pieces of the cloud stack, we need to be having a different discussion. It's not should I be encrypting things? You should, and there's no reason not to, especially when you're talking about data on disk. But rather, how do I ensure that the people who need access to this environment or the services that need access to this environment can have it, but if something goes awry, I can respond in real time, I can shut that access down, and I can do it without taking out my business. It's really easy to pull the plug. But imagine if you're Netflix, I used them a few minutes ago. If somebody suddenly gained access to a machine and was doing something nefarious with it, you can't just shut down Netflix, right? So you have to find a way to be able to handle that dynamically, robustly, and maybe you constantly are switching your infrastructure around. You're constantly bringing servers down, bringing servers up, and making it very, very difficult for there to be any single point of failure. It's a different sort of security. It's a way of thinking about security as being more like the cloud itself, more able to spin down and spin up in response to threat, and less let's just lock everything down and make it impossible to gain access to it. That doesn't really work once you're talking about enterprise business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering kind of, you sort of mentioned like enterprises. I'm wondering more like about, say like smaller, medium-sized businesses. A lot of the cloud people I've talked to have, said, obviously it's a benefit for them because, someone like Amazon's going to have way better security than whatever they can put together.
Yeah.
So I imagine a lot of them are sort of using these cloud, kind of based services. So I'm just wondering, for someone like them who probably doesn't really have, an IT person who really knows a lot about that, is there any kind of advice you can give them that's kind of really simple?
100%. Yeah, 100%. It's a great question. So there are a few things that you can do when you're at that scale. One, you're right, you probably don't have a huge IT department. You probably have a smaller IT department. But that makes it even more important to be using things like Chef and Puppet. You can look at things like Ansible if you want to go down the open source route. Bring in Docker so that you can move at scale. And increasingly, those platforms have community editions or the ability to use them without having to make these significant long-term investments. Conjur does the same, right? So if we look at somebody who's got a small or mid-sized business and they're starting to figure out how they're going to do least privilege, there is a community edition of what we're looking at that we can make available so someone can try it. You can try any of these different pieces, get them in place, do it correctly. And in many cases, the question that we encounter is, hey, I am a small business. How do I think about doing security for my configuration management? And the answer is rarely that you should build it yourself. I think that that's the temptation we see a lot of people start with. So if I had a piece of advice, it would be to dissuade people from doing a bake it in-house approach, because that's where you end up seeing things like where you get an organization putting their SSH keys in a Git repository. And that's just a terrible anti-pattern. If you go and chat with the guys who come up with the configuration management tools, or you go listen to the founders of different companies that are touching things like Git, they'll tell you don't do that. It's just not the right way to handle it. And so I think that's the advice that I would start with is use the community tools, use the free tools, but do it in a way that makes sense and avoid these anti-patterns that put you at risk, because you probably have less ability to withstand a catastrophic failure than General Electric does if they had something go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to get your opinion too on the story. You kind of mentioned it earlier. They found basically a database with I think 1.2 billion user credentials in, which is quite a lot. So I just kind of wondered about that sort of in relation to the cloud. I mean, obviously, with everyone sort of with more data, being accessible, via the internet and the cloud. Just wondering if you kind of see any concerns sort of along those lines with, the amount of credentials being stolen and more opportunity for things like this to happen?
Yeah, definitely. It's getting to the point where it almost feels like everyone's username and passwords in a database and has been breached, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. One, assume even in your personal life that your username and password are at risk. Don't do stupid things. Don't use the same password for your bank account that you do for logging into Reddit. Don't share the same credentials with 5 or 6 different sites, because what's going to happen is you're going to end up having that password breached somewhere, and suddenly there is an escalation of privileges and somebody's doing things you don't want them to do. I think the more relevant piece there, though, is that I read an interview with someone who was talking about this particular breach, and they had said that what was found was that the Russians who were speaking with whatever forensic investigation firm was engaged here were able to answer the challenge questions for this particular individual. And they had amassed enough information that it wasn't just that they had usernames and passwords, but they could successfully impersonate them across the board. And so this is where you start getting into this idea of zero trust. Maybe the user on the other end of this particular authentication, this auth chain, is able to say, I'm Kevin and I can answer all of these questions, but we still need to have some logical protections in place where we can say, if that happens, we don't want that person or those credentials to be able to be used for everything. So on an individual level, think about having two-factor authentication. Think about requiring that you have something like your cell phone or some other thing you have so that even if someone can answer your challenge questions, they can't gain access to your most critical accounts. On a slightly more business-like perspective, think about this in terms of what you allow user accounts to do. Assume that anyone's username and password or increasingly things like SSH keys might be compromised. Do your best to avoid it. Don't put usernames and passwords in databases. Don't put SSH keys on disk. Keep this stuff out of code and code repositories. But be very diligent in looking at what levels and what permissions different people should have and restrict them to the least privileged account possible. It plays out in the consumer world, but it's probably even more important when you start thinking about what it would mean if somebody could successfully impersonate, oh, I don't know, like Marissa Meyer, and said, oh, I'm Marissa at Yahoo, and I can answer all of her challenge questions. Probably shouldn't let someone, even if they say they're Marissa Meyer, go shut down Yahoo's website, right? And that's kind of where we start thinking about this segmentation of privileges.
Yeah, one question, maybe it's a little unrelated to the cloud, but just kind of a follow-up on that. I'm just kind of curious. You see all these stories about, tens of thousands or millions, or in this case, billions of credentials being stolen. So I'm just wondering, as a cybercriminal or criminal organization, I mean, what's the first thing, that you would do with that? Like say you get 1 million credentials. I mean, what's next?
From a consumer credential perspective, the thing that you probably see the most often is that they'll open lines of credit, and they'll do it at the store level. The most common way we see this play out is that somebody goes and opens a credit card with a half dozen different stores, and they're usually things like Lowe's or Kohl's or sometimes jewelry stores where the goods they can get can be readily resold. And so you're essentially creating a money laundering chain, and it's very easy to then turn those assets that are purchased with those lines of credit into cash or capital that can be used for other things that are presumably more nefarious. You'll also see that people will use these types of credentials to sign up for long-term services. So you might find that somebody gains access to enough information to successfully impersonate someone, and then it's classic identity fraud. They get a social security card, or they start opening passports, and those go for relatively high dollars on the black market. I think really it's not that somebody wants to go post as you on Slashdot or Reddit or NBC.com. It's that they want to use your credentials and what they can learn about you to get enough information to perpetrate some kind of identity theft crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then just kind of bringing it back to the cloud, we're kind of getting to the end here. Just wondering if there's any sort of kind of new things or kind of trends that, you've seen. It's been about 6 months probably since we talked to you last, so is there anything kind of interesting in terms of like the cloud space that kind of stands out?
Yeah, so I heard a almost offensive term for where people were with cloud deployment a year or so ago. And what I heard was that people only put their crap locations in the cloud. And I forget who said this, and it is a little bit funny, right? But historically, I think there was some truth to that. There was a time in which a lot of people were still starting to feel out what the cloud could do, so they put very non-essential information out there. But increasingly, we're seeing companies and people, but companies as well, put business-critical infrastructure and data out into cloud. And it's changing the profile of companies like Conjur, but also like CloudLock. There's a company called ThreatStack here in the Boston area that's starting to look at this and provide some services around protecting that kind of information. And it's also changing the landscape for development and operations for the DevOps people that we talked about earlier. So there's really a confluence here, or convergence here, of business sensitivity and business criticality and the kinds of independent software companies that are allowing organizations to feel secure and moving their data out into the cloud. It's no longer just sort of the non-essential information. It's stuff like the core database for an organization, or it's the entire infrastructure stack. If you go look at what Netflix did under Mike Kyle, who is their former VP of IT Ops, And they said, we're just not going to have on-prem anymore because it's too slow. And you wouldn't have seen that 3 years ago, I don't think. Or if you did, it was from very early adopters. So in some ways, cloud's growing up, and more people are putting the kinds of information out into it that require really secure processes from the moment that you start building product all the way down to the point that you push it out the door and support it.
Yeah, so, kind of with that, happening and sort of more important information being out there, I guess I'm kind of curious from your perspective if you think that, most of the companies doing that are doing that in a secure way, or do you think that there's maybe a significant percentage, who might be, opening up some vulnerabilities?
I think we've got the base security in place. I think that there are some foundational elements that have been created over the last few years. It's very, very wise to go and put in something to do access and permission analytics on your Google Apps environment, or make sure that your sensitive data, if it's not supposed to be in Salesforce, isn't there. I think the emerging frontier and where things are going to go is around access intelligence, and that's the auth-Z problem, and that's what I was talking about earlier. We're looking at more speed, basically, more speed and more sensitive information. So architecting your cloud environment in a way that is managed and monitored, and then being able to meet audit and compliance requirements around that so you can continue to move to the cloud and continue to push data out there, that's where I don't think very many people have put a lot of thought yet. That's changing, and that's part of why I made the decision to move like I did. But I think that landscape is going to look very much like what Active Directory might have looked like 10 years ago, or what public cloud security looked like 3 or 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have one final question. Basically, the last few weeks we've been doing this, we've been sort of asking everyone just their thoughts on encryption. Because just I guess like 2 months ago, it was sort of the 1-year anniversary of Edward Snowden, and everyone's kind of been talking about encryption the past year, and he's been saying it's sort of the answer to a lot of problems. So just kind of trying to get everyone's really just kind of high level overall opinion, if there's anything sort of interesting about encryption that stands out, or if you kind of agree with people like Snowden that that sort of is the answer to a lot of things.
When I was at a Forrester Information Management Forum event earlier this year down in Florida, they had a CISO versus a hacker panel, and one of the things that a lot of the CISOs in that room walked away with and said, and which I agree with, is that encryption is the last bastion for many organizations. And if something were to happen, if we found that Triple Desk was vulnerable, or someone worked their way through AES-256, for many organizations, the jig would be up. They just don't have robust management once that particular thing ceased working. Now, that might not happen, right? There's a lot of sort of conspiracy theory, quantum computing stuff that would have to occur before we could say we can magically break AES-256, unless you believe that it's already compromised, and I don't think that's likely. But I think encryption is a necessity, but it shouldn't be your only thing. And hope is not a strategy, right? So you don't just hope that it's enough and go from there. So definitely do it, but don't treat it as though you can flip the switch and say, well, we've encrypted our data, so everything's fine. No, defense in depth remains a valid way of approaching security, and realize that you're on a continuum, and there's convenience on one side and security on the other. So put encryption in place, encrypt on disk, but have ways to make sure that even if your encryption were to fail, or it weren't applied, or someone gained access to the decryption key, you still have secondary protection and auditability around the data that you're looking to secure.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Everybody out there, hope you have a good rest of the week and good weekend. And starting next month in September, we'll be sort of changing these Hangouts to more of a webinar kind of format. We'll be having several different guests on, so look forward to that. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, all.